Hello, I'm Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for being here today. Past Forward Conversations with American Experience is our monthly virtual series where we discuss the enduring themes explored in our films with historians and experts. Today's Past Forward conversation explores how the choice of a vice presidential candidate can shape a presidential campaign and a presidency itself. It is inspired in part by our new film, The American Vice President, which is now streaming on the American Experience YouTube channel and on the PBS app. In today's conversation, our panelists will discuss how and why particular vice presidential candidates are chosen by presidential hopefuls. They'll examine how the media and the general public can interpret these selections differently, asking whether a VP pick can be a decisive factor in an election. And finally, the panelists will take a closer look at how the campaign role of a vice presidential candidate can reveal the role they'll play in a potential administration. As always, this is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions in the live chat and we'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Carlisle Companies. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, members of the Better Angel Society, including the Fullerton Family Charitable Fund, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the American Experience Trust, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station, GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now, it is my privilege to introduce our panel for this conversation. Michael Kazin is a professor of history at Georgetown University. Go Hoyas! He is the author of seven books about U.S. politics and social movements and the editor of the Princeton Encyclopedia of American Political History. He writes often for the New York Times, The Nation, The New Republic, and other outlets. Christopher J. Devine is an associate professor of political science at the University of Dayton. His books include Do Running Mates Matter? The Influence of Vice Presidential Candidates in Presidential Elections. He is also co-editor of the forthcoming book, Second in Command, Reevaluating the Role of Vice Presidents and Running Mates in Modern American Politics. Today's conversation will be moderated by Adrienne Lentz-Smith. Dr. Lentz-Smith is an associate professor of history at Duke University. She is a scholar of African American history, as well as the histories of the 20th century United States and the US and the world, and the author of Freedom Struggles, African Americans and World War I. Thank you again for joining us. Please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Cameo, and welcome, Michael and Chris. It's great to be here with you today to talk about the choice of a running mate and how that can shape a presidential campaign and an administration. So I'm going to get us started with a big but basic question, which is, why should we care who the vice president is? Even modern presidential candidates have been known to minimize the vice president's role. So I ask both of you, can the actions of a vice president really affect the day-to-day lives of Americans?
Chris, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Adrienne. Thank you, Jared, Kendra, Cameo, everybody who helped set this up. This is really a privilege to be here and excited to get to talk about the vice presidency. Thank you, American Experience, for covering this important topic, especially during an election year. I think it does matter to some voters who becomes vice president of the United States. It's good for various reasons, as I'm sure we'll get into. The constitutional responsibilities of a vice president, that's one thing, but the reality of what they do day to day, as for example, Kamala Harris is talking about during the campaign, positively. Her opponents are talking about things she didn't do. There's limits on the power of a vice president, but they can play an important role. There's some important pieces of legislation you may have heard about during the debates that were passed because she was able to cast a tie-breaking vote. Kamala Harris was. Of course, we know, and as the documentary extensively covered, the role of a vice president in succeeding the president under various circumstances is especially important. But even short of that, there are many things that they can do day to day that have an effect on Americans, directly perhaps, but also in some cases indirectly by influencing the president and other members of the administration.
Yeah, as we'll talk about, and the film makes clear, I think, very, very nicely, the vice president's become more important office since the 1960s, especially since the assassination of John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson took over in obviously a very key time in the Cold War and American domestic politics as well. And it used to be that most candidates for vice president were not exactly non-entities. They were certainly known, but they were chosen not because they might be a future president, but because they balanced the ticket geographically. Sometimes they were more conservative than the candidate, or more, to the left of the presidential candidate, but they weren't supposed to really matter. But obviously, when the president dies or resigns, in the case of Richard Nixon, they matter quite a bit. And actually, as the federal government's power has grown, in different ways, the vice president's power has grown as well. His potential power has grown as well. But as Chris knows very well, depends how much power the president wants to give the vice president. It's a great paradox. It's both a very powerful position potentially, and yet a very powerless position if the president wants it to make it a pretty powerless position. Because most vice presidents, especially in the modern era, like to be president. They're thinking about being president, even though sitting vice presidents have very rarely become presidents. Nevertheless, they always hope they can become president, almost every case, and often run for president afterwards and after they've been vice president. But they're very much constrained by what the president wants to make of them and what kind of powers the president wants to give them, and whether they can take any independent stands at all, which is quite rare.
So, Michael, your answer to that question makes me think that in some ways the power of the vice president, or the power of the vice president, to some extent, is a little bit up to the discretion of the president. But can I ask you what responsibilities the Constitution does give the vice president specifically? And has the Constitution shaped how the public views the office and its occupants historically?
Well, as the film lays out very well, I mean, the Constitution only gives the vice president two powers: to take over if the president is not able to, and to break a tie if the Senate has a tie vote. Which Kamala Harris actually broke a lot of ties, especially in the first 2 years of Joe Biden's administration, when the Democrats didn't have majority. So, I think most Americans, going back to the 19th century, did not think the vice president mattered very much. It was always a he until Geraldine Ferraro in 1984, and she, of course, was not elected, but in terms of being nominated, they understood, I think, that the party chose this person because they somehow balanced the ticket one way or another. Because for her, it was they were trying. Walter Mondale was trying to win female votes, women's votes in 1984 to widen the gender gap. But in some ways, it was for a long time a more symbolic office than anything else, I think. And Thomas Marshall, who was vice president under both terms of Woodrow Wilson, I think he was the one, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, who said, "What America needs is a good 5-cent cigar." And he was better known for that than he was for anything he actually did as vice president.
A follow-up question for both of you that may or may not be influenced by how many episodes of Veep and Scandal I've watched. Are there other factors like TV or movies or the press or even the candidates themselves who or that have played a role in how the vice president is viewed?
So I can start there. It's a great question, Adrian. So it's something that's always fascinated me about the vice presidency, that, there's this historical context that Michael was just walking through very nicely. And again, the film does as well, that the vice president didn't have much in the way of constitutional responsibility. They were often these non-entities. And so a perception has taken hold over time that the office is basically a joke. And that's not true in the day-to-day operation of the vice presidency anymore. Again, Michael was referring us to the constitutional responsibilities, but a lot of that change has been informal. Joel Goldstein, constitutional law scholar who is interviewed in the documentary, has some of the definitive work on this, including his book, The White House Vice Presidency, where he explains that so much that evolution in power has been informal in nature. That's taken hold over the last 50 years, especially with the vice presidency of Walter Mondale. What hasn't caught up is the way that we portray vice presidents in popular culture, in movies and TV shows and all their kinds of ways. And the dichotomy I often see is as far as representation of the vice president, usually portrayed as an idiot, someone who's kind of incompetent, not up to the job. The only alternative, it seems, in popular culture is to portray the vice president as instead a schemer, someone who is trying to invoke the 25th Amendment that we heard about in the documentary to knock the president out of office. So that's the portrayal we get. They're not important in terms of the work they actually do. It's just that they're either a joke or they're plotting to take over power. And it's just not a good representation of what vice presidents actually do. And unfortunately, I think sometimes people mistake it for reality, in part because of the historical context that we were just referring to, which is now out of date.
A couple of people I've mentioned the people I was going to be on this show, and some people said, "Oh, is Selena Meyer going to be there as well?" The great candidate, the star of Veep. The name of the candidate is star of Veep. And one of the paradoxes here, not much power at all, a joke, or just a schemer, and a lot of power. I've noticed Donald Trump's campaign recently has been basically saying to Vice President Harris, of course, running for president now, when she complains about problems in the country, economically or whatever, they say, "Well, you've been in power for 4 years. How come you haven't done anything about it?" And of course, as vice president, she's constrained. She can't criticize President Biden. At the same time, she doesn't want to make it seem as if she's had no power. And so in some ways, that's a microcosm of the problem that especially modern vice presidents have faced, is that they are responsible for what the administration does, but they don't set the policy. In almost every case, and when they do set the policy, they're seen as rogues, and the president has to sort of calm them down. It doesn't happen very much, so that's a real problem. It's a strange office in many ways. Personally, I would rather we had no vice president and we had a parliamentary system where the party would choose the new president, like they do in Great Britain, the new prime minister. But that's not our constitution.
Right. So before we go to, we're going to show a clip in a second, everybody. But before we do, Chris, will you say pretty quickly, just a quick overview of how vice presidential candidates are chosen? How does a campaign choose one?
Yeah. So this has changed a lot over time. It used to be something that was done at the party convention when we didn't know who the presidential candidate was going to be until that point. It was often quite up in the air. And then afterwards, they decide on, by the way, who's the running mate going to be. That changed really in the early 1970s. The parties reformed their rules so that, unlike what we saw in 1968, famously at the Democratic Convention that nominated Hubert Humphrey, who had not even run for the presidential nomination, rules were changed so that delegates to the National Party Convention would be bound to whoever won in their state. So primaries actually mattered. The upshot of that is we then get a window in most elections since then for several months, just like Donald Trump in 2024, where we knew well in advance who the presidential nominee was going to be. And so he had this time period to study with his team for months. Who are the possibilities? Let's investigate who they are. Let's find out. It's often called a vetting. They could vet their financial records, their past policy positions, their health, all kinds of stuff. Incredibly invasive and thorough process where they try to catch anything that could come out during the campaign. And so there's a lot that goes into this choice. It's in many ways a personal choice, but there's also a political reality that the presidential candidate still has to pay attention to some elements within his or her party to make sure that it's something the whole party can rally around. But it's mostly a choice that's made by the presidential candidate, then ratified at the party convention. That's the modern process we know, I guess, in a nutshell.
Yeah, it is a remarkably invasive process, this vetting. And as Rachel Maddow says in the documentary, it's not like anyone as a small child looks ahead to their future and says, you know what I want more than anything? To be vice president of the United States. So we've looked at the constitutional role of the vice president, and we've gotten a sense of the conflict between the popular perceptions of the job and the actual importance it can have. Let's turn now to a clip from the documentary, The American Vice President, where we'll hear about the role of how the role of the vice presidency changed after the passage of the 12th Amendment, and how John Tyler set a precedent that would change the office forever. Let's watch it now.
Under the framers' original scheme of election, the vice president was to be the literal runner-up, the winner of the second most electoral votes for president. But the rise of political parties and the prospect of ideological opponents serving in tandem made that approach untenable, and in 1804 helped to spur the 12th Amendment.
What the 12th Amendment did is it created a method whereby electors were to cast separate votes for president and separate votes for vice president. Under the original method, you had a field of candidates who were generally a presidential caliber. You were taking a shot, and there was a good chance that you could end up president. After the 12th Amendment, because the vice presidency lacked any substantive powers, there began to be a decline in the number of and the quality of candidates who would stand for vice president. You would be hard-pressed to find very many Americans who could name vice presidents from the 19th century.
Vice presidents were really chosen by political party organizations. Many times, the president was chosen because he was part of the winning faction, and the minority faction was given the vice presidency often as a way of keeping the party together. That tradition continued even after it became much more of a presidentially selected position, because those presidential candidates themselves had an interest in some kind of balance.
During the first half-century of the new republic, no president died in office, and the succession clause went untested. Then, in 1841, the 9th Commander-in-Chief, William Henry Harrison, succumbed to pneumonia barely a month after his inauguration, and Vice President John Tyler stepped into the breach, boldly declaring himself President of the United States.
His claim was controversial because many people read the Constitution, which was ambiguous, to say that if the president died, the vice president simply acted as president, that he simply exercised the powers and duties of the presidency while remaining vice president. But Tyler insisted that he was president, refused to be dealt with on any other basis.
He was subsequently referred to as His Excellency, the Great Usurper. The press had a field day with it. He would often get mail addressed to John Tyler, acting President of the United States, and he had a rule of thumb that he would return those unopened, regardless of who they came from. The Tyler precedent took care of what happens when the president dies in office, albeit not formalized by the Constitution. 7 subsequent presidents became President of the United States because of that precedent. Millard Fillmore, Andrew Johnson, Chester Arthur, Theodore Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, Harry Truman, and Lyndon Johnson.
So as the clip mentions, the caliber of vice presidents decreased after the 12th Amendment was ratified. But even before that, when men like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had the job, VPs were still sidelined in their administrations. So this is a question for both of y'all. What does that say about the nature of the office from the time it was created? And these are questions for both of y'all, did the limited responsibilities of the vice president mean that the choice didn't matter much even before the 12th Amendment?
Well, there wasn't that much time before the 12th Amendment. As you know, it was a very small sample. But obviously, Thomas Jefferson, was a major figure in American politics and the revolution. He'd been Secretary of State before he was vice president. They mattered greatly. But again, there's a important sense, I think, in which, as we were saying before, that this was not. I think the film mentioned this earlier in a clip you didn't show, that there was not much time given to thinking about the vice president in the Constitutional Convention. It was sort of an afterthought, and that if they thought about it more carefully, they might have given the vice president more powers, or not had a vice president at all. Because I think it's an office. I'm not a comparative political scientist. Chris would might know more about this, but I don't think our vice presidential institution has been copied anywhere else in the world, at least not by any other major country. And that probably says something about whether it's was a good idea at all. Is that true, Chris?
Well, to your point about parliamentary systems earlier, there just aren't that many comparatively presidential systems.
Right.
And so there are a number of countries that have a vice presidency, but with some different formulations, South American countries in particular, but pretty limited elsewhere, and often with less in the way of formal responsibilities. I don't know if there's maybe the best comparison. I'm not aware of one, but certainly it's an unusual institution that the United States has. And especially, referring back to this history and how things have changed over time, that original setup of the runner-up becoming the vice president. Maybe I'm missing it. Maybe our viewers can help, but I'm not aware of any system that would operate that way today. And I think one way this plays into the history we're discussing is that, look, initially, John Adams was pretty much an ally of George Washington. They were, I guess you could say, sort of in the same political party, though it was much less formalized then. But then when Adams is elected vice president in Jefferson, we don't have formal parties, but they were clearly in different camps. And Jefferson, even while in office as vice president, was taking shots behind the scenes at John Adams, orchestrating a lot of the criticism against him. For that matter, when Jefferson comes into office, and it's 1804 that we get the 12th Amendment. So 1801, Jefferson comes to office, and his vice president is Aaron Burr, who was supposed to kind of be his running mate, but actually ended up being his competitor as they tied in the Electoral College. So when we look at their role prior to that, I think part of that is tied up in, well, they weren't really allies of the president anyway, so that limited the possibility of cooperation. If I could just throw in one more thing here too, I think in this discussion very broadly, we should consider that the vice president plays a unique role in, and I do mean unique, I mean one of a kind, in that he or she is a member of both the executive branch and the legislative branch. Think of another officer like that. This is, by the way, if anyone's paying close attention to the news here, some of the criminal charges against Donald Trump, there's some arguments where that comes down to, in relation to January 6th, was he dealing with Mike Pence as a member of his administration, part of the executive branch, or was he dealing with him as president of the Senate, which is a constitutional role of the vice president? So vice presidents have always had a foot in both branches. They step more into the executive branch, as we saw even a little in the film with Spiro Agnew's role coming into the White House. By the way, he gets a budget line under the executive branch as well. So we see this evolution. We can mark many different points in it. Some of it goes back 100 or so years, but progressively, vice presidents have moved away from the Senate, which they rarely preside over. Not since Alvin Barkley, Harry Truman's vice president, has someone regularly presided over the Senate as vice president. They've moved away from the Senate, and they've shifted more towards the executive branch, but they're still sort of members of both.
And also, interesting, aside of that, interesting anecdote about it, before he became vice president, Lyndon Johnson had been majority leader of the Senate, and he was kind of a runner-up for the Democratic nomination in 1960 to John Kennedy, one of the runners-up at least. When he became vice president, he insisted on keeping his office in the Senate, next to the Senate chamber, because he felt really comfortable in the Senate. He had run the Senate. Master of the Senate is a biography of that part of his life by Robert Caro, the famous biographer of Johnson. And I took a tour once of the Senate with a Senate historian, and he showed me where Johnson had kept his office, large office next to the Senate chamber, because he was so loath to give up that center of power, because he knew he had much less power as vice president. But of course, then he becomes president, and that's a different matter. If I could say one thing, Adrian, if you don't mind, also about the politics of the president and vice president. Sometimes, of course, the vice presidential candidate is chosen in most cases because he or she will back up, of course, the policies of the president, even be from a different state. Obviously, they have to be from a different state or different part of the party. Sometimes in American history, when the president has died, it can lead to an important change in policy, which has had big impact on American history. And the best example of that probably is when Lincoln died and was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson took over. Andrew Johnson was a former Democrat from Tennessee. He'd been supported the Union. He was an anti-Confederate figure and was opposed to enslavement. But as president, he was cajoled, seduced by the former Confederates who he looked up to. He was from a poor boy family, and he opposed pretty much everything that the Republican Congress wanted to do during Reconstruction. And he vetoed a lot of bills, civil rights bills, Freedmen's Bureau bills. And then he finally got impeached by the Republican Congress because he had opposed their Reconstruction policies. So imagine if you had a radical Republican, someone who supported Lincoln's policies and maybe went further than that, who'd been the vice president. That history of the so important Reconstruction period in American history did so much to frame the history of since then in America, especially towards African Americans, but in general in American political powers. Andrew Johnson was a real obstacle towards advancing equal rights and many other rights as well. And he would not have been there if he hadn't balanced the ticket in 1864 for Lincoln.
I mean, you're both talking about a sort of dynamic interplay between the legislative branch and the executive branch. I'm wondering whether or not the kind of expanding role of the vice president as part of the executive branch is tied to the expanding power of the executive branch more broadly in the latter half of the 20th century.
I think you're exactly right to point to that, Adrian. That's a great point. Consider that presidents just have to do more than they used to do. Congress used to have a dominant role, at least at certain points in American history. We can trace that movement to a lot of things, including kind of the Cold War and expansion of some of the national security imperatives for a president to deal with, which required a vice president to be more in the loop. Harry Truman famously did not know about the nuclear bomb until he took over as president, even though he'd served for a few months as Franklin Roosevelt's vice president. But there's just more ground to cover. And I think that is part of that evolution. If I can go back to, I was referencing Joel Goldstein's excellent work, and others have done this, Jody Baumgartner and others, on the role of the vice presidency in, let's say, the last 50 years, the modern era. What does the vice president do? Well, and Michael was pointing in this direction as well, that it's not that there's like a formal requirement that's changed. The Constitution hasn't changed on the VP's role, but the way they're used has tended to change. Arguably, there have been some exceptions in the last 50 years, but for the most part, people looked at what Walter Mondale had done as Jimmy Carter's vice president as a top-level advisor, what's often called a troubleshooter for the administration. He didn't have a certain piece of bureaucratic turf he was defending. He was just kind of a generalist within the administration. That last person in the room kind of concept that we often hear about, including in recent administrations, that's been the role of the vice president. The president doesn't have to use the vice president that way. They just tend to because they do have so many responsibilities, and they need someone they can trust, handpicked in this case, someone they can trust to provide good advice, someone who supports the administration and is going to be working toward their success. That's essentially the asset that a vice president is in modern American politics.
I think that's right. There have been exceptions too. Dan Quayle comes to mind, senator from Indiana, who was picked because he was younger than George H.W. Bush and 1988, but I don't know, what responsibility Bush gave him actually, and when he tried to run for president himself, he didn't get off the starting blocks basically. So he became something of a joke even while he was vice president. And so in some ways, there are vice presidents who have sort of been throwbacks in terms of the image of the office. But for the most part, since Mondale. Vice president has a lot more powers. And even before that, vice presidents during the Cold War were often used, especially Richard Nixon was used to sort of travel around and show the flag. And Lyndon Johnson, who was vice president, went to Vietnam at least once or twice. So there was a way in which vice presidents were used and still are used, I think. This happened with Kamala Harris as well, to sort of show the flag and to handle some negotiations with foreign leaders, but not the final ones, not to make the final decisions. But in that sense, sometimes they operate as sort of shadow secretaries of state or something, or at least helping to communicate the president's desires in foreign policy.
So, how much does the possibility that the vice president could become the president affect the choice of the vice presidential candidate, and once they're chosen, how they're measured by the public?
So I'll actually just start by sharing one anecdote on this. This was from my first book with Kyle Kopko on vice presidential candidates on the home state advantage. And I was surprised to go back and find this in 1960 when John Kennedy was announcing that he was going to run for president. Young John Kennedy. This is like the second day of 1960. They did things a little later back then. And he was asked, well, why don't you run for vice president? This was on Meet the Press. And he says, well, people expect the president to have a normal life expectancy. And they don't think that something's going to happen where the vice president's going to take over. And of course, we know how that story ended, right? And we saw some of that in the documentary. So I think people know, they've always known that there's this possibility. As far as whether that factors how people vote for president, I have to say this kind of ties in with some broader themes of my research, especially with Kyle Kopko on like our book, Do Running Mates Matter? Kind of our big conclusion is that people don't generally vote on vice presidential candidates because they know, even if there's that possibility, the possibility of a vice president taking over, there's a certainty that when you elect someone president, they're going to be president, and probably for the whole time, but at least for part of that time. So I think people care. They do. It's just the way I like to look at it in elections. People have to care about a lot of different things. I mean, folks are facing our audience right now. You're facing this choice where you have to consider policy and personality and leadership and experience and all these kinds of things. And only so many things can be decisive. So I think voters care about the possibility of succession, and they might vote on that in a really alarming situation where they truly believe someone is not prepared or would be dangerous in office as vice president or potentially president. Generally speaking, I think that's going to get drowned out by a lot of other concerns.
Yeah, I think that's right. Just one addendum to your point about Kennedy. He did run for vice president in 1956 because Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee, threw open the convention, and the convention actually chose who was going to be vice president. So he gave a speech, and other people gave a speech. He didn't win, but it was rare that there was this open contest at the convention itself for the vice presidential nomination. To repeat and amplify Chris's point, I think if the vice president mattered, there's a example, fairly modern history about 36 years ago, where the vice presidential nominees were Dan Quayle for the Republicans and Lloyd Bentsen, senator from Texas, for the Democrats, and they had one vice presidential debate on television. As now, there's only one debate, and Quayle, who's a young man, fairly callow, was going on about how he was like John Kennedy. He was young and ambitious, and he could do a lot as a senator. He could do a lot as a vice president, then president, he hoped. And Benson got off a line, said something like, I knew Jack Kennedy, Senator. You're no Jack Kennedy. And that was the one line everyone remembered from that debate. And Quayle had no response. And after that, clearly, if you're going to vote that year based on the vice presidents, Lloyd Bentsen would have won a landslide. He was a senior man. He had a lot of gravitas. But George H.W. Bush won the election pretty easily by about 8 percentage points in the popular vote and a huge majority in the electoral vote. So if the vice presidents mattered, it should have mattered then. But clearly, it didn't matter. And I think, looking more recently, I think it's possible Sarah Palin hurt John McCain some. She was seen as not being very good in her answers to questions. But it's pretty clear that whoever was vice president, the Democrats would probably win that year because of the financial crisis. So I think in the end, that's one of the reasons why Veep was the hit show. So people sort of think that the vice president doesn't matter, but the vice president very much wants to matter, and there's that paradox there.
So we've talked a bit about. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
What were you going to say, Chris?
Can I get a quick data point on that to what Michael is saying? If you were to ask people, and it's regularly done, you ask them in an election, is the choice of a running mate important to you, vice presidential candidate? A lot of people, about 80% typically will say yes. partly because you're asking them about something and they assume that it's important. If you go back to them at the end of the campaign and you ask them, tell me about something that you liked about the presidential candidates, the percentage of people, this is over a wide span of time, this is American National Election Studies data, popular political science survey source. You ask people, tell me what you liked or disliked about the presidential candidates. The number of people who, on their own, bring up the vice presidential candidate, it's less than 1 out of 20, about 5% or lower, usually closer to about 2%. So very few people, and also there I've seen a survey question where they have asked people, has a vice presidential candidate ever changed your mind in an election? And about 10% of people say yes. So while it feels like running mates matter a lot in the campaign, the reality is for many people, for most people, it doesn't end up changing their vote.
So we've talked about the selection of a presidential candidate, and y'all have talked actually a little bit about the ways that the growing American power on the world stage changed the office of the vice president. But let's go deeper on that. We're going to begin by watching another clip from the American vice president, where we see how, amidst presidential illness and Cold War tensions, President Eisenhower and Vice President Nixon tried to assure continuity in presidential authority. Let's turn to it now.
There was no provision in the Constitution for dealing with a situation where the president is disabled. There's actually no formal mechanism for discharging the duties of the president to an acting president, even the vice president. There was no clarity around who's in charge.
People increasingly look to the president to address both domestic and international problems and to handle an increasingly complicated global situation in a nuclear age.
I expect to be back at my accustomed duties, although they say I must ease my way into them and not bulldoze my way in them.
It made the president more powerful, more significant, and that meant that the vice president became more significant. And so ultimately the vice presidency gets pulled from Capitol Hill, where the vice presidents had presided over the Senate and done really little else, down Pennsylvania Avenue to the executive branch.
President Eisenhower was cognizant and very transparent, really, that he had health issues. He had concerns about the lack of clarity in the Constitution in terms of inability, or presidents being incapacitated for some period of time. And so he gave himself the authority to decide when an inability existed. And even more important than that, this same directive, he gave that authority to Vice President Nixon to decide if the president was incapacitated or unable to fulfill the duties of the office. But it didn't have the force of law.
And it was polite and unstressful, apparently, between them, but it was really precarious for the country. What if there had been a dispute as to whether or not the president was disabled and the vice president thereby enabled? What if the president and the vice president disagreed about that? It did put the issue of when and how and whether the vice president is running the country front of mind.
So we're going to turn to audience Q&A in just a second, but before we do, I want to ask y'all another question. As the film goes on to show, the passage of the 25th Amendment solved for problems like the one President Eisenhower and Vice President Nixon faced, but it also created more situations where a vice president might have to assume presidential power, even temporarily. Has this affected the role a vice president is given in an administration? Are they expected to be more informed than before the 25th Amendment? Like, would Harry Truman in 1976 have known about the bomb before he became president, for example? Next question. Let's start with you, Michael.
Well, I'll let Chris respond to that. He's a real scholar of this, more than I am. So,
Hey, thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. So I'll frame it this way. It's hard to tell how much this has changed over time, just kind of inconsistent data on how this has been tracked. But clearly, one thing that we see in polling on what people are looking for in a running mate, they care about a range of things. Some things you think they care about, they don't really, home state and a lot of that stuff. But they do care that a vice presidential pick be someone who is qualified to be vice president of the United States and potentially the president. Very consistently, the polling shows that. And in fact, again, with my research with Kyle Kopko on what actually influences how people vote, most of all, it's their perception of the vice presidential candidate as a reflection on the presidential candidate. You were, Adrian, referring back there to the Palin selection. That's come up through the conversation. The concern there, I think, for most voters wasn't necessarily that she would be vice president of the United States, at least in terms of being decisive in actually making that choice. The real effect, and we can show this even statistically through our research, the real effect was on perceptions of John McCain. When people thought that Sarah Palin was not ready to be president, they faulted John McCain for that. They doubted his judgment because of it and in turn became less likely to vote for him. Now, Barack Obama was the converse of that in choosing Joe Biden, who was perceived by the American public at that time to be well qualified for the vice presidency or potentially the presidency, and they seemed to reward Obama for that. They had better views of his judgment. We could say the same perhaps about other choices that have went one way or the other. George W. Bush picking Dick Cheney as a relatively less experienced presidential candidate, perhaps acknowledging that and choosing someone who reassured people that whether it was Cheney taking over or even just advising Bush on a day-to-day basis, that he would have someone there who could help make up for a lack of experience on his end. So short version of that is voters really do value experience and credibility in a potential vice president, whether that's because of changes over time, including the geopolitical situation, is a little harder to say, but that is our modern reality.
I think something else comes in here too, which is the media. Before, of course, there was a presidential debate beginning in 1960, but the first vice presidential debate was, I believe, 1984, right? And he was only one of them, but still, now, as we see, watch the news, vice presidential candidates are expected to go campaign as vigorously around the country as presidential candidates. They have a media image. They do interview shows. They are co-candidates in a way that before we got our politics from screens was much less common. And so that means that their relationship with the presidential candidate is very important, because there's thousands of reporters out there who are looking for any sign of disagreement, any sign of a problem between the presidential candidate and the vice presidential candidate, as they are differences between the president and the vice president once they get elected. So that's important in a way that before you had a wraparound media where everyone could follow what the vice president's doing on their phones 24 hours a day, and on the campaign trail, the nominees for vice president. That also gives the candidate for vice president a presence, an importance, a familiarity to voters in a way that they didn't have before.
So I'm going to turn to an audience question. This person asks, no sitting VP has been dropped from a ticket since Henry Wallace in 1944. Is that a measure of the vice presidency's independent power? And what would be the most likely circumstance for a VP getting dropped?
Well, 44 actually is an interesting example, because Wallace was very popular among a lot of rank and file progressive Democrats, but very unpopular among urban bosses who were then very important in the Democratic Party, in the North especially. He was seen as being too friendly to the Soviet Union, seen as someone who wanted to, continue ties with the Soviet Union even after the war was over. And so he was dropped from that ticket, even though a lot of Democrats wanted him to stay in the ticket. And if he stayed in the ticket, if he become president, it would have been probably a very different presidency than Harry Truman's, because he was much less in favor of Cold War policy, certainly than Truman was. But I don't know. You want to, Chris? I think you want to answer the other part of that.
Yeah, so I'll actually mention too that there was a more recent one, 1976, when Gerald Ford, who we saw the process in there where he elevated Nelson Rockefeller through the 25th Amendment, to the vice presidency, and then dropped him very shortly after, as he ran for the presidency in his own right in 1976. And I think that was less Ford's choice to drop him is something he would have wanted to do. It was more of a reaction to internal Republican politics. He was getting challenged from the right pretty aggressively by Ronald Reagan, then running in the 1976 Republican primaries. And Rockefeller was kind of a rallying point for conservatives who thought that Ford wasn't conservative enough. And as we saw in the documentary, he was someone who represented more of a moderate to liberal faction of the Republican Party. But I think this reflects, the fact that there's such very few circumstances just reflects the change in the selection process, where starting with FDR, who really asserted this right to choose his vice president in 1940, he so badly wanted Henry Wallace, who he then dropped 4 years later. He was able to leverage his power within the party as a two-term running for a third-term president, wildly popular, and say, this has to be basically my choice. If I don't get my choice, then you can nominate someone else for president. Took a while for that to come around, but basically that became institutionalized over time. And so because it's a more personal choice by the presidential candidate, they're less likely to walk that back later, hopefully because they've made a good choice. But I would even argue, given what I was saying about the evidence on what affects voters, I think it's just a bad signal to voters about the presidential candidate's judgment if they have to say, wait a minute, that pick that I made 4 years ago, high profile, could have picked anyone. I made a mistake. Let's go back. I don't think that makes them look very good.
I think
the
that's
most
right.
public bad call ever.
Yeah, it sounds like the president made a mistake. So even Dan Quayle was kept on the ticket in 1992, and Bush lost, but it wasn't because of Dan Quayle.
Yeah. So this audience member asks, you've mentioned Walter Mondale a couple of times, but exactly how did he change the vice presidency significantly? What are some examples of things he did while president?
Sorry, take that. I did watch Walter Mondale, and most of them picking up on Joel Goldstein. Again, you saw him in the documentary. Highly recommend to this viewer and others the White House Vice Presidency, Joel's excellent book on this topic. You can't trace these things entirely to one person or one point in time, but Mondale clearly was the pivot point in terms of vice presidential power. And as Goldstein goes through so well in his book, and others have covered this as well, basically what happened is that when Carter was interviewing potential vice presidential picks, they had these very high profile conversations, and Mondale was pretty clear that I only want to do this if I'm going to have real power. And they worked out an agreement. They actually drafted an agreement in advance, and they stuck to it once in office, that would give him, it wasn't certainly like a specific power that he would do, but he would have. It's more so that he was someone who would reside in the White House, be in the middle of the action. His staff, the vice presidential staff, would be fully integrated into White House operations. Instead of having separate and competing staff, the vice president could be shut out. This was fully integrated. Access to the White House paper flow, regular meetings, lunches. And this has varied somewhat over time, but that's basically been the pattern, is that the vice president would be completely integrated into the White House operations, be a sidekick, and in many ways have that right to be, as we've often heard again in recent times, to be the last person in the room, not necessarily the most influential, but someone who would at least have the president's ear. Mondale, more than anyone, marked the starting point for that.
Also, I think important that Mondale, unlike a lot of vice presidents before and even since, was already an important figure in the Senate. He was an important figure in trying to rein in the CIA. He was an important person in the Church Committee, which is this great expose of the CIA and FBI that came out in 1975. He was a main mover in that committee happening. So he was already a major figure in American politics in the Senate in a way that many vice presidents before him were not. I mean, Lyndon Johnson was similar, even more powerful at the time, but Richard Nixon was just a one-term senator, and a lot of these figures were just picked because they were younger and provided geographic balance. But Mondale provided geographic balance. He was in Minnesota, of course, and Carter was from Georgia, but also he was somebody clearly who could step in, who knew Washington too, and that's something we haven't talked about. But in more modern times, sometimes the background, the expertise of the vice presidential candidate is different from presidential candidate, and that's a real selling point, not just in the campaign, but also for a president feeling you can work well with somebody who doesn't just come to the office from Alaska, let's say.
Yeah. I'm such a Gen Xer that every time you say Walter Mondale, my brain flashes to the newspaper comic Bloom County. Question from the audience: do you see any flaws or potential loopholes in the 25th Amendment?
Well, I mean, Chris knows much more about this than I do, but it's a process, right? It's not like it all of a sudden just kicks in. Oh, 25th Amendment, sure, let's use it. You have to get agreement from several people. It's a committee responsibility, right? In many ways, and that makes it very perilous. I mean, what happened? For example, some people talked about after Joe Biden's disastrous debate, even before he pulled out, that maybe Kamala Harris should get people to invoke the 25th Amendment. But that was unlikely to happen, first of all. But the question is whether the president, in any way has to go along with that or not. And I'm glad it's there, but at the same time, it's not an open and cut process by any means.
I think one thing I'll mention there, and I'm actually going to look back on my shelf to see if I have the right one. Unable is a book I found very helpful by Brian Kalt, K-A-L-T. And one thing he deals with there is getting at this idea of disability for the president. When is the president not able to serve? Some of the conversation that we saw after January 6th about invoking the 25th Amendment brought up these conversations about what exactly these terms mean. And his contention, at least, and I found it persuasive, is that it truly is meant to refer to an inability, a physical or mental inability to continue in office as president of the United States. Some wanted to use it more broadly as somehow being sort of unfit for office. There is, of course, the impeachment process that could potentially take care of that instead. And I think that's an important point to make. Whether that's a flaw or not, I think it just gets to the inherent ambiguity of trying to design an amendment that would anticipate various circumstances. But that is at least a point of contention at times in interpreting and applying that language.
And I assume, it's never happened, of course, it's never been invoked, but I assume that the Supreme Court could step in as well and say, oh, no, the president, was able. So it's tough to use in a crisis, I think, and that's of course the only time that it would be invoked in a crisis. So I'm glad it's there, but
See,
I'm a bit scared about if it really had to be used.
so your answers are yes. Do you see loopholes? Do you see issues? Yes.
Yes.
So for the last audience question, I'd like to ask each of the panelists if they have a favorite forgotten vice president. Hamlin and Wallace are two that I find fascinating. And I'll say, I too am a big fan of the quixotically optimistic Henry Wallace. I've got a soft spot for him. Michael, I'll start with you.
With me?
Mm-hmm.
What can I talk about? A vice presidential candidate who was.
I expected you to.
Unusual. In 1904, Democrats nominated an 81-year-old lumber and coal executive from West Virginia named Henry Gassaway Davis, who'd never served in office himself. He was 81 years old. They were running a long shot campaign against Theodore Roosevelt. The presidential candidate was a guy named Alton Parker, a judge from New York. And it was pretty clear they weren't going to win, but they needed to run a campaign, and they had very little money. So he was Henry Gassaway Davis has $60 million, which is worth about $1 billion today, and at least. He kept the campaign, in the black, so to speak. But if he'd become vice president, he would have not just been the oldest vice president in American history, obviously the oldest president in American history, until Joe Biden. So that's my favorite non-elected vice president. Others beyond that, let's see. Well, Henry Wallace, though I wouldn't have agreed with some of his foreign policy, but I think Lyndon Johnson, again, is an interesting choice just because he was such a powerful figure in charge of the Senate, and then felt so diminished as vice president. At the same time, he was ready to step in, especially domestic policy. But he was hamstrung partly because he hadn't made policy. And Vietnam policy was really sunk his presidency. And if he had been part of that discussion more and had some responsibility for it, it's possible. Again, this is a counterfactual, and as historians we know, you can't lay answer counterfactuals any kind of conclusive way. Nevertheless, the debacle of the Johnson administration in Vietnam could have been solved if he had listened to some of his own instincts and not decided to escalate the war in 1965. But he felt like, as vice president, he had to carry on John Kennedy's policy, and he'd be criticized if he didn't do that. And so that he was, in some ways, more experienced, more tested, more ready to be president than most vice presidents, and yet he had this fatal flaw.
Yeah, Chris.
So I think the only topic in life more fun than obscure and underappreciated presidents is obscure and underappreciated vice presidents. Thank you for this question. Michael bought me some time to run through some in my head. So I'm working on a book about the 1924 presidential election when Calvin Coolidge, who had been vice president and then succeeded Warren Harding after his death in 1923, he took over. And then in 24, because back then you didn't get to replace the vice president, right? We didn't have the 25th Amendment. In 24, Coolidge runs in his own right, and he chooses Charles Dawes as his vice presidential candidate. Of course, they're successful. And Dawes is quite a character and really comes into office kind of trying to whip the Senate into shape to exert his influence there. And the Senate, fights back. And there was one point actually where they made him kind of a laughing stock. A pretty serious guy, but to show him who was boss, they scheduled an important vote when he had gone to take a nap, I believe, back at his hotel room or wherever he was staying. And he had to, when he found out the vote was going on, rush back, and he didn't make it in time. So they kind of showed him a thing or two. So, but he at least had the fighting spirit. He was trying to make the vice presidency more relevant. He just wasn't very successful at it.
Right. The Senate Fights Back, by the way, is actually a pretty accurate name for some of the movies in the Star Wars prequels. So there's that too. I think that is a wonderful question on which to end our conversation, a wonderful pair of answers on which to end it. I thank both of you so much for taking part and being the heart of this incredibly timely conversation today. And I'm going to pass the mic back over to Cameo for closing remarks.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation exploring the how and the why of the vice presidential selection process. The American Vice President is available to stream now on the American Experience YouTube channel and on the PBS app. You can watch our past forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you liked what you saw today, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new conversations, opportunities to watch new films live with us, and more. Thank you again for joining us. Have a great evening.